We had just started previewing the Clemson football season, but now we're thrown back into the chaos of conference realignment. I'm Ryan Cantor. Thanks for watching this video. If you're not already, please subscribe to this channel. Really appreciate it. All right, so what's going on? Today we learned Colorado to the Big 12. That didn't seem like the biggest deal, except just that it highlighted the instability of the Pac-12. But now today, bigger dominoes fall. Oregon, Washington leaving the Pac-12. That means their four best, biggest, strongest brands and best programs overall are now gone. UCLA and Southern Cal, they already left. Oregon and Washington will join them in the Big Ten. What's so interesting? Well, a lot of interesting parts, but one interesting thing is because the Pac-12 was already crumbling, the Big 12, the Big Ten was able to get Oregon and Washington at a discount. They will not pay them the full TV deal money, at least for the first 6 years. So that just highlights how desperate Oregon and Washington were to get out of the failing Pac-12. We already learned that Colorado was going to the Big 12 today, or depending on when you're watching this, Friday, we learned Arizona also going to the Big 12, not yet announced, but rumored and I think probably inevitable. Arizona State and Utah, I believe they'll also end up in the Big 12. That leaves four schools, and I think by a pretty wide margin, the four weakest brands in the Pac-12 remaining. That's Oregon State, Cal, Stanford, and Washington State. Here I'm showing them going to the Mountain West. You could essentially call it a merger, and it'd probably be wise to keep the Pac-12 branding, but nonetheless, I think those four kind of move out of what we have been calling Power 5. Maybe now we should call it Power 4, or maybe soon 3 or 2. They'll be moving to a lower tier of football, most likely. I could see a scenario where Stanford and Notre Dame join the Big Ten, but we haven't heard any rumors about that. So right now, most likely scenarios, those four are kind of out of that top tier of college football. So there's never stability in this. It seems really doesn't seem like schools have a ton of say. I mean, they make the final decision on where they're going, but in reality, it seems like the TV executives are controlling this and causing all of this. There's some bigwigs in LA and New York City, making money and not really caring what happens to the sport. I don't really think this is great for the sport. Now, the one thing I will say about these moves is they're definitely less devastating and upsetting than some of the prior moves, like Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. The reason I say that, what great rivalry games, what tradition do you lose? You still want UCLA, USC. That's a good game. Well, it's just going to be a Big Ten game. Still want Oregon, Washington. That's just going to be a Big Ten game. It's not going away. You would like to keep the Civil War, Oregon and Oregon State. You'd like to keep the Apple Cup for sure. Washington State. Well, those maybe will still be played as non-conference games. Beyond that, I don't know that there's another game on here where you're thinking, man, like Texas A&M, Texas. And initially when Texas A&M left and that game stopped, that was bad for the sport. It's a good thing it's coming back now, actually. At least sometimes as part of the SEC. But I don't know that you're going to lose a ton of great tradition with this. It's just sad to see it consolidate. But generally speaking, this is definitely less devastating than some of the other shakeup we've seen. All right, so what you probably care about most is, what does this mean for the ACC? I've been advocating for this for a while. I'm going to touch on this, but then I'll shift gears and talk about the potential of Clemson to the Big Ten. This is what a potential 26-team Big 12 could look like. So you've got 3 schools in Florida, and then you've got Georgia Tech, Clemson, North Carolina. Basically, you have all the ACC schools in North Carolina except Wake Forest. So Wake Forest is odd man out, much like Oregon State and so those 4 schools in the Pac-12. They'd be one of those teams left out. So you've got that is 8 truly Southern schools, and then you kind of have that Mid-Atlantic kind of central grouping there: Virginia Tech, West Virginia, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville. That's 13 teams. It's essentially a 13-team conference, and all you've done to the ACC is you've removed Boston College, Syracuse, Wake, and replaced them with Cincinnati, West Virginia, and UCF. I don't know that that's a downgrade. It might even be an upgrade. And then you pair them with this kind of Western division which is pretty strong. Utah, BYU, TCU, Kansas State. It's definitely weaker than the East, but I think that combo gives you a big, broad national conference, while depending on how you do the schedule, you could avoid some of the pitfalls that these big national conferences like the Big Ten are going to have. What you could do here is have conferences that make sense for baseball, volleyball, tennis. You're not flying from Miami to Utah every year necessarily. Here's how I would do it. Here's what a potential Clemson schedule in that world could look like. This is a 9-game schedule, hypothetically, 4 permanent rivals. So you play Florida State, NC State, Georgia Tech, and North Carolina every year. That doesn't change. Then you have 4 more Eastern Division games. They'd be semi-annual. So that's Miami, Duke, Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, Louisville, all teams that are in the ACC today. Then West Virginia, which I think I would take that over Wake Forest. Cincinnati, take that over Boston College, and UCF, I'd take that over Syracuse. So you'd flip those every other year. And then 1 Western Division opponent, and that would rotate. So you would not play teams in the West very much. They wouldn't feel like they're part of your conference, and I think that's okay. You'd have a cohesive Eastern Division that would essentially serve as your conference, and you'd match up some against the West. And then, of course, if you win the East, you'd play the champion of the West. So it would give you kind of that reminds me of the 90s, like Lakers, Celtics, Eastern Western Conference. It would have that feel to it. I think that would be unique. No, it's not going to bring in the outrageous money that the Big Ten and SEC do, but it's going to reset the contract. I think it'll bring in more money than the ACC and the Big 12 are getting now. And it fixes a lot of the issues with sending a volleyball team. Sending the Rutgers volleyball team to Oregon is about as silly as it gets. You could avoid a lot of that with this. So that's what I would love to see. In a way, it saves the ACC and kind of saves the Big 12 and does the best you can to keep those teams in the top tier of college football. But that's not the rumor we're hearing. We're hearing Clemson or Florida State, or more likely both, to the Big Ten. Here's a map of what that would look like and kind of why I hate it. Clemson is obviously shown in there in South Carolina with the logo. Really only 2 teams in this conference make any sense for Clemson geographically. Maryland, which isn't that close, but it's East Coast. It's not New Jersey. And they were obviously a former charter member of the ACC, really one of the 2 schools with them, and Clemson sort of formed the ACC. So that'd be great to have them, and then Florida State. Beyond that, everything's really far geographically, culturally. Just you're going to LA, you're going to the Pacific Northwest, going to a bunch of schools like Purdue in the Midwest, and you're going to Rutgers and Penn State. Not ideal. This is great for the money, but to me, it would make college football a lot less fun for Clemson fans. You'd really have one road trip. It's a reasonable drive, depending on where you live. I guess if you live in Charlotte, maybe Maryland's fairly reasonable. If you live kind of more on the Atlanta side, the Florida State trip's reasonable. That's really it. As a student, I loved going on road trips. We went to a baseball series at Duke. We went to one at Wake Forest. All that's out the window, and God knows this is not good for baseball, and certainly is pretty silly for sports like volleyball. And no, volleyball should not be a major consideration, but all of those sports, soccer, which just won a national championship, going out to Oregon, is pretty silly. Here's another option that I think is very realistic, and here we add North Carolina and Miami to the mix. Now, here's where it starts to make some sense. I could get a little excited about it. Perhaps they could do some sort of a pod system, so Clemson's guaranteed to play. Maybe they play Maryland, North Carolina, and Florida State every year, and then you make sure in basketball they're playing those teams more, things like that. Maybe even Miami's part of that mix, and that would certainly make this a lot more palatable. North Carolina and Miami are obviously huge brands. They might not be great in football today, but they command a lot of interest and have big fan bases. So I think this is probably, if I'm being honest, the realistic best case scenario for Clemson right now. Now, I will say it would be great to be in the ACC for 2024, 2025, because you're going to get that automatic bye if you win the conference. You don't need to jump that soon. You just want to make sure you have a landing place ready to go, so you're not stuck making $30, $40, $50 million a year less for 10 years, right? That's what you have to avoid. And so that's why you're seeing so much movement right now, or so much talk about it, I should say. This might be a reach, but this is kind of the dream scenario. Is not only do you have the 4 schools we just mentioned, but here I've added Duke. You want to preserve that Duke-UNC basketball rivalry, still the best rivalry in the sport of college basketball. Perhaps Duke could get it in there. That gives you another school in North Carolina, not too far from Clemson, traditional charter member ACC. Virginia Tech, that connects the Carolinas to Maryland. Now it's starting to make sense geographically. Louisville makes a ton of sense geographically. They border Ohio, not too far from Cincinnati. Not too far. They're not too far from Cincinnati, but they're not all that far from Columbus, where Ohio State is either. So here you're starting to see this making some sense. And then, of course, Georgia Tech. So now you've got the entire Eastern Seaboard from Florida all the way up to Rutgers. That's Miami, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Clemson, 2 schools in North Carolina, Virginia Tech. That's 8 ACC members. That breaks the grant of rights because there's a majority of the conference leaving. Perhaps this is wishful thinking, but I think this would be a win-win for a lot of these programs. Now, even in this scenario, some schools are going to get burnt really bad. Syracuse, Boston College, Wake Forest. I think there's a lot of scenarios where they're in trouble. And a couple others here, like Virginia, also getting left out to have to join a much weaker conference. But I think this is probably the best case scenario for a lot of the teams in the ACC. So really what I'm looking for, can we get out of the ACC? Not for 2024, but can we have a path to making more money, whether it's out of the ACC or major reforms we don't know are possible? It doesn't sound like ESPN's willing to work with a conference, so their only hope is to essentially dissolve it, merge it, something like that. So we'll wait for news. Frankly, I'm hoping we don't have news until after the season. We could push this off a little bit further, but Clemson and the ACC is probably not something our children will enjoy, depending on how young our kids are. So leave your comments below. Love to hear your thoughts. And again, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, please do so.